She pointed a gun at my pregnant daughter and called it protocol.
That's what Verna Klatch, president of the Juniper Hollow HOA board, screamed before she pulled the trigger. The wind chime shattered first, then Maris dropped. Blood soaked the baby blue tablecloth beneath her belly before I even processed the sound. And Verna? She holstered her pistol like she'd just swatted a fly. "I warned you people not to provoke me," she said to the guests frozen around us. "He lunged at me. I defended myself." But he didn't lunge. No one did. The only thing Riven Hale, my son-in-law, had in his hand was a plastic plate of deviled eggs. No warning, no raised voices, just a bullet, a lie, and my daughter's scream. I'm Galen Thorne, and I spent 30 years as a federal crime scene reconstructionist. That means I know exactly what bullet trajectories don't lie about. And Verna just fired one into the wrong family. The chime that hung above Maris's head, metal and glass, handcrafted by her husband from the shells they collected in Mendocino. It caught the bullet before her body did. And I'm going to prove it. Subscribe now, because I'm not just telling you what happened. I'm about to show you what HOA power unchecked can cost. And if you're in a neighborhood like ours, you need to know how fast it turns fatal. They thought I'd be shaking, broken, grateful for help. I was already checking for primer residue on the fragments before the paramedics arrived. I could tell by the blood mist arc that the shot wasn't point blank. She lied. Again. But Verna wasn't new to lying. She'd been circling our home for weeks, filing citations over chalk drawings, wind direction flags, and the fact that Maris's porch swing was visible from the road. Her latest violation: improper community use of yard during third trimester events. That was actually typed on the warning letter she shoved in our mailbox the week before. My daughter's baby shower was unauthorized assembly, she said. A few paper lanterns, cupcakes, and pastel chairs were a threat to HOA values, apparently, but this was never about a party. It was about control. Maris is all I have left. After my wife died, and after the department closed that Texas case with the pregnant Jane Doe we never ID'd, I left federal work. Quiet house, quiet town. I bought the lot beside hers to build something safer, something slower, but I should have known peace doesn't come to places like Juniper Hollow Preserve. This place is dressed like paradise. Wraparound porches, bird sanctuaries, sunset HOA newsletters. But beneath the vinyl siding and fake smiles, it's a powder keg, and Verna Klatch held the match. I warned her once, calmly, firmly. When she barked about the string lights we strung between our porches, I said, "This home is private property. The HOA has no jurisdiction over shared family installations unless defined by municipal easement." She blinked, and that was the first time she called me a threat. See, when people like Verna can't control you with citations, they escalate. She pushed until she had her moment, and when she got it, she fired. And that wind chime. God, that damn wind chime. I watched her bullet pass through it, shattered glass and metal ringing out above the screaming, Maris's hands on her belly, her lips mouthing, "Dad?" I replay it every time I close my eyes. And no, she didn't die. Not that day. But Verna Klatch didn't miss either. She hit something deeper, something older, and she woke up the part of me I buried with that unnamed woman's case file in Uro 6. I know angles. I know powder burns. I know false flag justifications disguised as neighborhood safety. Verna made a mistake thinking no one would question her word. But I don't need a lawyer to prove what happened. I need trajectory, and motive, and silence. She gave me all three. And when I'm done, no HOA board in this country will want to use the word self-defense in front of a man who still remembers what a real blood spatter looks like. Now I want you to tell me, where are you watching from? Because if it's a neighborhood like mine, you better check who holds the master key. The blood hadn't even dried on the patio when the first email hit the neighborhood listserv. Subject line: Community Disruption Incident. Emergency HOA Clarification. Verna wasted no time. She used that HOA account like it was a megaphone and painted my daughter as the aggressor. According to her version, Maris's husband became physically threatening after multiple verbal warnings, forcing her to act in legally protected defense of self and community safety. There were no verbal warnings, no threats, no lunging. Just a sun-drenched backyard filled with pastel gift bags and sugar cookies shaped like ducks. and a gunshot that turned a celebration into a trauma scene. And yet, I watched it happen again, now through the lens of her narrative. It didn't stop there. Within 2 hours, Verna had filed an emergency fine of $2,000 for violating HOA assembly protocols, citing unregistered group activity, unauthorized signage, and excessive decorative debris. Decorative debris. She meant the hanging mobiles and photo board Maris had spent 3 weeks assembling. She meant the swing her husband sanded and re-stained so her back could rest easy during pregnancy. She meant the wind chime that caught the bullet. Maris was still in surgery when I opened that email. I didn't say anything, not to the neighbors who started calling to check in, not to the nurse who gently placed her hand on my shoulder in the waiting room. My phone buzzed every few minutes with some new version of concern, but it wasn't concern. It was calculation. I've spent enough time at crime scenes to recognize when people are trying to get ahead of something. The real horror didn't come from Verna's lie. It came from how fast the neighborhood folded into it. Juniper Hollow always wore its order like armor, trimmed hedges, matching mailbox fonts, garden flags that changed with the seasons. Verna didn't just enforce rules, she built a religion around them, the kind that rewards silence and punishes deviation. Maris wasn't raised to shrink. She didn't roll over when Verna fined her for hanging a wreath made of beach shells instead of approved seasonal foliage. She didn't cave when the board threatened to suspend her voting privileges over unlicensed structural ornamentation, which was just the flower trellis her husband built during paternity leave. And she sure as hell didn't apologize for wanting a baby shower in her own backyard. That's what Verna couldn't stand. It was never about the rules. It was about obedience. And when people refused to kneel, tyrants reached for weapons. What sickened me was how many let her get away with it. I'd kept screenshots over the last few months, partly out of instinct, partly because something never sat right. Citation dates were inconsistent. Verna had been issuing violations without board consensus. In some cases, she'd referenced non-existent amendments or misquoted zoning guidelines altogether. I let it go, told myself we were the newcomers, that maybe things worked differently here. But I knew better. Before I retired, I spent years testifying in federal courtrooms where chain of custody and margin of error determined whether a man walked free or died behind bars. I've seen what happens when procedure is bent just a little, just enough. That's how monsters find daylight. Verna's history wasn't just a paper trail, it was a noose. I just hadn't realized how tight she'd already cinched it. There was the time she threatened the Martells for having a support animal without visible documentation. The time she tried to have the Pender boys suspended from the community pool for playing a Bluetooth speaker too loud during swim practice. Every so-called violation had a common thread. Vulnerable targets who didn't have the energy or knowledge to fight back. Maris was different. She knew her rights. She'd even helped a few neighbors draft appeals. That's when the real heat began. Anonymous complaints. Warnings. And then, that last HOA meeting, Verna's voice trembling just enough to sound scared, telling everyone she felt unsafe around the thorns. She was building the excuse before she ever reached for the gun. And now, somehow, she was winning the story. I stared at her email, reread the phrasing. Escalated due to non-compliance, duty to defend, protective action taken under advisement of standing bylaws. She was dressing murder in policy, and everyone who clicked archive without reading it was becoming part of the defense. I looked at the stack of citations piled in my drawer and realized they weren't random. They were a blueprint, one I'd been ignoring. That was going to change. I heard the knock before I saw him. 3 slow taps, spaced far apart. Like someone wasn't sure they had the right house, or maybe hoped no one would answer. When I opened the door, Elliot Bram stood on my porch, shoulders hunched like he'd aged a decade overnight. He didn't meet my eyes, just nodded once, and took off his faded cap. The same tan HOA board hat they all wore like badges. His hands were shaking, even though it was warm outside. Didn't come to argue, he said, voice low. Didn't come to defend her either. He meant Verna, but he couldn't say her name. I stepped aside without speaking. He shuffled in, glancing toward the living room like he was walking into a courtroom instead of a house. Elliot had always been the quiet one at the HOA meetings. Sat 3 seats to the left of Verna, eyes down, flipping through bylaws like they meant something to him. I used to think he was just tired, or indifferent. But the way he looked now, like he was carrying something corrosive, that wasn't indifference. That was rot. I didn't know what she'd do, he started, wringing his cap like it owed him an apology. I knew she was forceful, but I didn't know she'd... He stopped. His mouth worked to finish the sentence, but nothing came out. She shot my daughter, I said. Finish the thought. He winced. I saw it, Galen. I saw her draw. There was no threat, no lunge. Riven didn't move. I felt something cold slide behind my ribs. I hadn't told anyone about the angle yet. Not the police, not the neighbors. Just me, the blood, and the chime fragments. If Elliot had seen what I thought he had... Why didn't you say that in your statement? I asked. He looked up at me then. Really looked. Because I'm afraid of her, he whispered. And because I didn't record it. That time. That time, I caught it. He didn't mean this time. He meant he had something else. Elliot turned, pulled something from his jacket. Not a tape recorder, not a phone. A USB stick, duct taped to a folded envelope with shaking hands. I record the meetings, all of them. Not officially, just helps me remember things. Doctor says my memory's not what it used to be. I never told her, never told anyone. I took the stick gently, like it might explode. What's on it? His throat worked like he was swallowing glass. Last month's board meeting, the one where she said if the police wouldn't stop unauthorized activity, we'd have to take enforcement into our own hands. My jaw tightened. She used that word? I asked. He nodded. Enforcement. Said you and your daughter were destabilizing the character of the community. Said we needed to restore compliance by demonstration if necessary. I didn't think she meant violence, Galen. I swear I didn't. But I did. The way she watched my daughter. The way she showed up at our fence line with her hand on her holster. The constant citations. The warnings that didn't come with official seals. She'd been circling us like a hawk with a clock in her chest. And now I had a thread to pull. I'm not asking you to go public, I said quietly. Not yet, but I need you to be ready. This, I held up the stick. This is a start. But when it's time to say what you saw, I need you to say it loud. Elliot's mouth tightened. He nodded once, but I saw the war behind his eyes. Fear and guilt, pulling him in opposite directions. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the door. She scares me, Galen, but what scares me more is how easy it was to sit through all of it and say nothing. I didn't respond. He already knew what I'd say. Elliot walked down the porch steps like a man walking toward a noose he was finally ready to admit was real, and I watched the door long after he was gone, thumb running over the edge of the envelope. It was time to stop waiting. I found Elliot Bram standing alone near the edge of the retention pond the next morning, hands jammed into the pockets of his windbreaker, shoulders hunched like a man hiding from his own shadow. The sky was overcast, heavy with the kind of silence that falls after something awful happens in a place pretending nothing ever does. He didn't hear me approach. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. His eyes stayed locked on the water, motionless except for the occasional twitch of his jaw. Elliot, I said quietly, not wanting to startle him. You saw what happened. His fingers tightened around the edges of his coat. He didn't look at me. I didn't see everything, he muttered. I wasn't close enough. You were on the boardwalk behind the hedge. You had the best line of sight in the whole yard. You saw it. Still nothing. His lips pressed into a thin line. Not denial, something worse. Fear. Elliot Brams wasn't a nobody in this neighborhood. He was one of the originals. Moved in when Juniper Hollow was just breaking ground, long before the board turned into a battleground. He'd served on the HOA for nearly a decade, mostly as treasurer, mostly quiet. People liked him, trusted him. That's why Verna kept him around. He finally spoke. I didn't expect her to actually fire. You heard her threaten it, I said. Didn't you? His mouth opened, then shut again. For a second, I thought he might fold into himself. But then he pulled something from his pocket. A silver zip drive, tiny and worn. I shouldn't have this, he said, voice low. I record the board meetings from my own memory. Verna doesn't know. She thinks I forget half the motions anyway. But I don't. I just don't argue. He placed the drive in my hand like it burned. It's from last month's session. You'll want to hear what she said when no one else was listening. I looked down at the drive, then back at him. You could have spoken up, I said. You still can. Elliot's jaw clenched. She said she was afraid of Maris, that she thought Maris was undermining community authority. She started quoting that nonsense about defensive stewardship again. Said if the board won't maintain order, then she'd do it herself. His voice cracked near the end. And when he finally looked at me, I saw the weight behind his eyes. Not just guilt, shame. The kind that festers in silence. I didn't think it'd go this far, he whispered. That's what they always say? I didn't press him. I just nodded and turned back toward the path, clutching the drive tight enough to leave marks in my palm. Later that afternoon, I locked myself in my office and played the audio. No enhancements, no filters. Just raw, ambient tension captured in compressed format. At minute 42, her voice came through clear. Verna Klatch. Calm. Unhurried. Discussing disruptive patterns of non-compliance and neighbors attempting to weaponize technicalities against board authority. And then, if the bylaws won't give me teeth, I'll find my own. Some people don't learn until you draw blood. My stomach turned. She'd been planning this. Maybe not the exact moment, maybe not the baby shower, but she'd been waiting for a reason, a chance to assert power beyond policy. She didn't just snap, she staged it. And everyone else? They'd let her. The HOA board had sat silent while she rewrote enforcement letters. They'd shrugged when she replaced quorum votes with executive decisions. Even Elliot, as conflicted as he clearly was, hadn't stopped her. He'd watched the slope tilt and said nothing until blood hit the lawn. I can work with silence. I've built entire cases on what people choose not to say. And now I had the first real crack in Verna's armor, her own voice, premeditating control through violence. It wasn't just a sound file. It was intent. Elliot had no idea how much he'd just handed me. The HOA didn't slow down. It doubled down. The morning after I received Elliot's audio, a notice was taped to my front door in red ink instead of the usual black. HOA Emergency Citation, number 34A, it read. A full-page, laminated threat disguised as legalese. They fined me for obstruction of enforcement activity and cited post-incident community destabilization. Apparently, my refusal to comply with their request for a public statement, an apology specifically, was now punishable by thousands in fees. I laughed, not out of humor, out of disgust. That wasn't the only message they sent. Neighbors started receiving forwarded statements from the HOA board warning about misinformation being circulated by family members of the injured party. They didn't even say her name. My daughter was reduced to a liability in their eyes, an inconvenience to the board's optics. The threat was spreading like mold through wallpaper. Quiet, invisible, until you press too hard and the whole thing collapses in your hands. I went to the mailbox and found 3 more citations stuffed inside. One for unsecured property perimeter, because I'd left my gate open for paramedics. One for damaging common flora, because blood had stained the lawn's edge. And one for emotional hazard. I couldn't even begin to guess what statute that one referenced. It was all nonsense thrown together to push me back into silence. I wasn't the only target. Across the street, the Hansens who had been at the baby shower found a notice in their mailbox citing non-compliant spectator conduct. No one knew what that even meant, but it didn't matter. Verna was setting an example. If you stand too close to the fire, she'll burn you too. Juniper Hollow had always run on compliance by exhaustion. People didn't fight because it wore you down. Time, paperwork, bureaucracy, it all blurred together until giving in felt easier. That was Verna's true power, not the gun, the process. But she'd made one mistake. She thought I was just another neighbor. I've spent years testifying before grand juries. I've reconstructed entire murder scenes from 6 blood drops and a crumpled photograph. I've worked with federal prosecutors who built careers on the kind of forensic reports I wrote between coffee breaks. Verna may control the narrative here, but I know how to write truth in language the law understands. Still, the timing mattered. I couldn't go public until I had enough to rip through the net she was casting over this neighborhood. A single misstep, and she'd spin it as harassment, vengeance, trauma response. That's how people like her survive. They turn the mirror back toward the victim and call it chaos. So I walked. I walked the neighborhood she thought she ruled, talked to the residents she assumed feared her more than they trusted themselves. I kept it casual. No accusations, no demands, just questions. What do you remember hearing that day? Did anyone else receive a citation afterward? Did Verna mention my daughter before the shower? Some looked away, some deflected, but a few cracked. Mrs. Beckley, who lived 2 doors down from Maris, admitted she'd heard Verna on her porch phone the day before the shower. If they think they can parade around without respect for the order of things, Verna had said, then maybe it's time they feel what disorder actually looks like. That line stuck with me. Feel what disorder looks like. She hadn't just lost control, she wanted a spectacle, a message. It was the same pattern I'd seen in vigilante cases we worked in Chicago. Neighborhood crusaders who masked vendettas under the illusion of keeping the peace. They didn't want order, they wanted submission. And I had the first layer of proof. Elliot's recording gave me intent. The citations gave me pattern. Now I needed exposure. I needed something that would push this from HOA infraction into criminal liability territory, where outside authorities couldn't ignore it anymore. And I needed it fast, because Maris was still recovering in ICU, and Verna was already telling the next lie. It hit me while I was staring at the wind chime. I'd collected the fragments myself after the police cleared the scene. They hadn't even bagged them, just brushed the debris into a corner near the garden bed and marked it as non-essential. But I knew better. The chime hadn't just been decoration, it had been in the bullet's path. I'd wrapped the shards in lint-free cloth and stored them in a clean tackle box lined with foam. Now, under the halogen light in my workshop, I laid them out one by one, glass slivers, bent aluminum, one copper ring warped by heat. There were traces of soot fused into the cracks. I didn't need a lab to recognize primer residue. What most people don't understand is that bullets don't just leave holes, they tell stories. Entry angles, burn patterns, velocity distortion, all of it's a language. I'd spent my life translating it. This wasn't about belief anymore, it was about physics. If Verna's story were true, that Riven had lunged and she fired in panic, then the bullet should have hit straight on, from chest level. But the damage to the chime? It was from above. Clean entrance through the upper quadrant, ricochet downward. I measured the puncture spread across 2 of the aluminum rods, angled, not direct. She'd been standing higher, probably at the porch steps. She'd aimed down. I took the bent copper piece and dusted it with a static brush. Flecks of black particulate lifted into the light. GSR, gunshot residue, confirmed. The chime had been struck mid-air, not after, not a ricochet. The projectile had passed through the ornament before hitting Maris. I diagrammed it out. Old habits die hard. I pulled a sheet of graph paper and charted the arc. A clean pass through the chime, a downward angle of 25 to 30 degrees, consistent with a shot fired from a higher vantage point at a stationary target, which meant Maris wasn't moving, and Verna wasn't being rushed. No adrenaline blur, no flinch response. It was a shot with intent. I took pictures of each piece, close up, then in layout. I labeled the parts, logged timestamps, and scanned my sketches. No digital overlays, no flashy software. Just the raw geometry of truth. This was the kind of evidence that would matter. Not to the HOA board, not to neighbors, but to outside investigators. Verna hadn't just broken rules, she'd crossed into premeditated aggression. And the only thing worse than an armed tyrant is one who thinks paperwork will cover her trail. The wind chime hadn't been mentioned in her incident statement, not once. She'd claimed to have fired in reaction to Riven's sudden forward motion, citing fear and proximity. But the blood spatter. Radius proved distance. The wind chime proved trajectory. The residue proved she fired directly at a calm gathering with her finger already on the trigger. I sealed everything in a labeled box and stored it in a lock case. Then I sat in silence for a long time, staring at my daughter's backyard through the window. The decorations were still up. Half-deflated balloons sagged under a weight they were never meant to carry. The swing where she'd been sitting was stained now. Not just with blood, but with fear. I hadn't touched it. Not yet. I wasn't ready. My phone buzzed. A text from Janner Kress, a contact I hadn't called in years. He worked claims audit now, mostly for property insurance providers who needed second opinions on strange neighborhood disputes. I'd sent him a vague summary the day before. No names, no locations, just an outline of an HOA shooting incident with conflicting structural evidence. His reply was simple. "This one smells like liability. I'm in. Got time to talk tomorrow?" That was the moment I knew the circle was starting to close. Verna could scream protocol all she wanted. She could spam the listserv. She could intimidate the neighbors into silence. But she couldn't stop what the fragments already knew. They'd carried the truth through metal, heat, and chaos, and I was going to make sure everyone heard what they said. Maris went into emergency labor 48 hours after the shooting. The doctors told us it was stress-induced, no surprise there. Her blood pressure had climbed past the safe threshold, and they didn't want to risk another hemorrhage. So, they wheeled her into surgery with a team of 3 and prepped for a C-section. I wasn't allowed in the room, hospital policy. But I watched the monitors. I watched the sterile hallway clock tick past, the point where time felt real. And I stayed still. Not because I was calm, but because the rage needed somewhere to settle. She shouldn't have been in that bed. She should have been opening more gifts in her backyard, laughing over baby names, drinking sparkling cider, and cutting the top layer of a lemon cake shaped like a duck. But instead, she was breathing through painkillers and monitors, while a team of strangers carved into her stomach to save what Verna's bullet nearly took away. And I stood there, fists locked behind my back, like a statue waiting for war. My mind wandered where it shouldn't, to another case, another victim, another pregnant woman. That time, it was a back alley behind a convenience store in Austin. 17 weeks along, no ID, one slug lodged in a broken cinder block. We never found who pulled the trigger. We buried her under a name no one claimed. I spent 9 months chasing the wrong lead. I gave my testimony, filed the report, and watched the file get closed because no one would fight for her. I failed her. But I wouldn't fail Maris. A nurse stepped into the hall and called my name. My knees almost buckled before I heard the second sentence. "They're both stable. It's a girl." For a second, everything stopped. Then I exhaled. The first full breath in days. I stepped into the room. Maris was pale, groggy, but alive. Her hand found mine like it had never let go. Beside her, swaddled and impossibly small, was the life we'd nearly lost. No tears, just silence. There wasn't room for grief in that moment, only resolve. I kissed her forehead, and she whispered, "Make sure she never gets to pretend it didn't happen." I nodded. I didn't need to ask who she meant. The next morning, I opened the wind chime box again and photographed every piece under new light. I cross-checked my angle estimates, added elevation data from Verna's porch height, and ran calculations on bullet drop. The numbers lined up. Everything pointed to a downward shot from the steps. Not a chaotic scuffle in close range like she claimed. But I needed more than theory. I needed teeth. So I dug out my old contacts. One of them, a retired civil liability expert named Monroe, now consulted with the state's nonprofit compliance board. Another, a former insurance loss adjuster, helped municipalities investigate corrupt neighborhood associations. I didn't give them everything, just enough to raise flags. And the flags went up fast. Verna's HOA didn't carry standard directors and officers' liability coverage. Turns out, she'd rewritten the board's renewal policy last spring, cutting corners to save budget, and quietly removing firearm clauses from the exclusions list. That meant any damage caused by a weapon discharge during an HOA-sanctioned event could fall directly onto the board, personally, which made the baby shower incident not just a criminal question, but an insurance liability disaster. And that, I knew, would get the right attention. Because money talks louder than trauma. It always has. Johnner confirmed he'd already flagged the HOA with a soft inquiry. The kind that doesn't show up on public filings but sends a tremor through the legal undercurrent of neighborhoods like this. He called it a preliminary concern for exposure. I called it the start of collapse. Maris's baby slept soundly the first night. Wrapped in hospital blankets, curled in a plastic bassinet that buzzed with machinery. I sat beside her with the chime pieces on my lap, sketchbook on the tray table, documenting the last angle, the final proof. I wasn't just building a case. I was building a wall Verna couldn't climb. Not with votes, not with fines, not with fear. And when it fell on her, it would fall hard. Elliot showed up unannounced just after dusk. I was still at the hospital, half asleep in the waiting chair outside Maris's room, when I saw him through the glass panel, standing stiff, hands wrapped around the straps of an old canvas messenger bag. His face was pale, sallow in the overhead light, like he hadn't slept in days. He knocked once and waited. I stepped out, cautious. He didn't meet my eyes. "I brought something," he said. He didn't wait for permission, just walked past me, down the hall, and into the small family consultation room the nurses had stopped using for the night shift. He dropped the bag onto the round table and unzipped it with a trembling hand. Inside was a thick spiral notebook, well worn and stuffed with folded papers, sticky notes, and a tiny voice recorder with a cracked screen. "Every meeting," he muttered, "board and executive, all of it." I didn't always understand what I was hearing, but I started writing it down. I pulled the notebook closer, flipping through. His handwriting was jagged, inconsistent, but the notes were detailed: dates, timestamps, quotes. The same names popped up again and again: Verna, Dreyfus, Harriet from Lot. 12, committee motions that never made the minutes, board votes held off record. "Elliot, what is this?" I asked. He sat down slowly, elbows on his knees, like the weight of the notebook itself was too much. "They stopped letting me speak 2 years ago," he said. "Told me I was too slow, that I forgot things. But I didn't. I just wrote everything down instead." One page had a scrawled quote in thick pencil. "We can't have neighbors undermining structure. People start thinking they have rights outside the board. This whole thing falls apart." Verna's name was underlined twice. Another entry read, "She said she'd carry if the board refused to back her up, that she was tired of being the only one enforcing things." I laughed then. I shouldn't have. The silence stretched between us. I reached for the recorder. "She didn't know I kept it after she banned electronics in executive sessions," Elliot said. "I'd leave it on in my coat pocket. Figured it was safer than trusting my memory." I clicked play. The quality was rough, background noise, shuffling paper, coughs. But the voices were clear enough. At the 32-minute mark, Verna's voice cut through. "The Thorns think this neighborhood is theirs now. That swing, that baby shower, that smug refusal to follow protocol. I'm not waiting for another board vote. I'll do what I have to." I paused it, looked up. Elliot didn't flinch. He stared at the carpet like it might swallow him whole. "I tried to stop her," he said. "Last week, when she said she was carrying for peace of mind. I told her she was scaring people. She said fear was good, said fear brings order." I opened the hospital-issued laptop on the corner desk and copied the audio files from his recorder, backed them up on a flash drive, labeled each clip, cross-referenced Elliot's notes with my timeline. The dates aligned perfectly. This wasn't just rogue leadership, it was premeditation, motive, a documented history of verbal threats, and the intentional erosion of internal accountability. And now, I had 2 forms of evidence from inside the HOA itself. "Why now?" I asked. "Why bring this to me?" He swallowed. "Because I saw the baby. I saw her when I passed the nursery window earlier. I don't even know her name, but she didn't deserve this. None of you did." I nodded once, quiet. Maris's daughter was the reason he finally stepped out of the shadows. Not guilt, not obligation, innocence. He pulled a folded envelope from his jacket, yellowed and creased. Inside was a formal complaint he'd drafted to the state oversight office but never sent. I read the first few lines: names, violations, references to structural insurance mismanagement. "You send this," I said. "You'll be part of the story." "I already am," he said. Elliot left before sunrise, didn't say goodbye, just disappeared down the corridor with his head low, bag empty, hands shaking. But what he left behind? That was enough to tear the board apart. I met John Cress outside the HOA clubhouse just after noon. The parking lot was empty. Most of the board avoided being seen in public since Verna's last email blast, accusing my family of inciting anti-governance panic. But that worked in our favor. Fewer eyes meant fewer barriers. Johnner stepped out of his car in khakis and a windbreaker, clipboard under one arm, sunglasses masking whatever opinion he might have already formed. He didn't offer a handshake, just nodded once, professionally. "Nice neighborhood," he said, glancing at the flower beds. "Deceptively quiet." That's how all cults begin, I muttered. He chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We walked around the clubhouse perimeter first. It wasn't large, just a prefabricated structure with stone veneer, some aging trim, and a few sad benches out front. But it was the heart of Verna's control. Every citation, every violation hearing, every board vote had been funneled through this building. Johnner took photos of the security cameras, only 2 on the property, and 1 pointed down, no longer functional. Insurance carriers don't like when camera coverage fails, he said. Neither do assault victims. Inside, the air was cold, the kind of over-air-conditioned chill you get when people want things to feel sterile. Johnner made a beeline for the bulletin board just past the front desk, scanning the notices posted under the plexiglass cover. I stood behind him while he examined the amended safety policy dated 6 weeks prior. There it was in black and white. Board officers may, at their discretion, carry personal protection when engaging with potentially hostile homeowners. This measure is considered a temporary board-sanctioned safety accommodation. Verna had drafted her own authorization. Is this even legal? I asked. Depends, he said, snapping a photo. But it sure as hell voids your D&O policy. That's what we were here for. Directors and officers insurance protects HOA board members from personal liability, as long as their actions fall within the bounds of their charter, law, and fiduciary duty. The moment they step outside that, the policy fractures. Verna rewriting carry permissions without member vote, that was a torpedo to the board's protections. Looks like this building is listed as mixed use, Johnner added, tapping a zoning permit on the wall. Community gatherings and policy administration. You know what that means? I shook my head. Liability zones overlap. If someone's harmed during a board event here, they can't claim private enforcement protections, especially not with weapons involved. He started snapping more photos, outlet wiring, stairwell elevation, faded fire escape markings. To me, they looked like mundane defects. To him, they were breach points. This building's underinsured, he said finally, and if she discharged a weapon during a function tied to her position, even off-site, that still touches the board's pocket. If I submit a liability query to the carrier now, it'll trigger a risk audit. And what does that mean for them? Worst case? He smiled grimly. The insurer drops the HOA, the board becomes personally liable, and Verna's next meeting comes with a subpoena. It was all I needed to hear. Back home, I pulled the files from my lockbox, the trajectory sketches, the chime fragments, Elliot's recordings, the logbook. I scanned each item into a shared folder and included detailed annotations, dates, timestamps, locations. Then I built the binder, one for Johnner, one for the State Oversight Board, one for me. I included the HOA's own documentation, the amended carry clause, Verna's contradictory statements, the post-shooting citations. Every lie folded over every law she twisted. At the end, I added a summary page. Pattern of abuse, premeditation, physical harm, financial exposure, Johnner called that evening. I've seen boards go up in flames over missing tax forms. This is Chernobyl. Will the carrier act? They'll investigate, and if they see what I saw, they'll pull the plug. You'll have your intervention. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was momentum, and I knew from my years in federal service, once you pull the first thread, the whole quilt unravels. I waited until just after sundown to finish setting the final pieces in place. The HOA clubhouse was dark, its blinds drawn like a bunker bracing for a storm. But the real preparation wasn't happening in that building anymore. It was happening quietly, in emails, in whispered conversations on walking paths, in the space between what Verna thought she controlled and what she no longer did. I'd spent the day finalizing the binders, each one labeled, indexed, sealed in clear sleeves with cross-reference tabs, audio files, time-stamped witness notes, forensic diagrams of the bullet path through the wind chime, insurance policy excerpts, the HOA's own contradictory memos. Verna's signature was on 6 of them, proof she knew, signed, and directed decisions beyond her authority. Johnner had already submitted his audit summary to the insurance carrier under a Category 3 risk concern. That meant their legal team was reviewing every action taken by the board in the past 18 months. Coverage suspension wasn't a question of if, it was when. But I wasn't just building a case for insurers, I was building one for the state. The Department of Nonprofit Oversight required hard evidence, patterns, violations, material harm. So I gave it to them. I submitted the full package through their intake portal, flagged it with 3 statutory breaches, misuse of nonprofit authority, negligent endangerment under a claimed role, and financial exposure through unauthorized charter amendments. By the time I hit submit, I knew the net had officially been cast. Still, I wasn't done. I walked to the neighbors' houses, quietly, carefully, and handed out summaries. Not the full files, not yet. Just enough to show them what was coming, not to scare them, but to prepare them. Once Verna's authority collapsed, a vote would follow. A new board would need to form. The community needed to see what had happened in the light. Most of them accepted the folder without a word. A few hugged me. One, Mr. Dreyfus from the corner lot, couldn't meet my eyes. He'd defended Verna at the last meeting. I didn't need his apology. I just needed his silence to end. Back at the house, I checked on Maris and the baby. They were both asleep finally. The hospital had discharged them earlier that afternoon, and my living room had become a temporary recovery ward. Pillows stacked, humidifier humming, bottles sterilized in a loop. I didn't remember being this precise when she was a child. But she was safe. That was all that mattered. The swing on her porch still bore the stain. I hadn't touched it. Not out of avoidance, but intention. It would be part of the presentation, a visceral reminder that Verna's shot hadn't just landed in flesh. It had landed in history. That swing was built by Maris's husband on his hands and knees after work, night after night, sanding every edge smooth so she could rock in peace. She'd been sitting in it when the bullet came, and now it would sit, quiet and unwashed, until everyone saw it. The last thing I prepped was the digital backup. I uploaded every file, photos, videos, audio, transcripts, to a secure drive and scheduled an automatic email release in case anything happened to me. Not paranoia, protocol. I'd spent too long around people who played dirty to ignore the possibility. Verna might not be capable of rational strategy anymore, but fear drives the desperate toward mistakes. At midnight, I opened Elliot's logbook one more time. I flipped to a page I hadn't noticed earlier, dated 2 years ago. Just one line. Verna said the only thing people respect more than rules is a woman who breaks them. Without consequences? It chilled me, because she hadn't been wrong until now. She'd built her kingdom on loopholes and silence, convinced that HOA authority could be stretched to fit whatever punishment she needed. But there are laws older than bylaws. There are truths louder than policy, and the moment the first certified letter hits her mailbox, she'll know what it feels like when those truths come knocking. I knew Verna would feel the shift before she ever saw the paperwork. That's how it works with people like her. Control isn't just about power, it's about atmosphere. They can smell it when the room stops fearing them. And the moment the HOA board started avoiding her calls, the temperature around her started to drop. The first real crack came that morning when Harriet from Lot 12 forwarded me an email chain between board members that Verna clearly wasn't meant to see. Short phrases, vague tones, just enough to read between the lines. We need to consider the optics if coverage is pulled. I'm not confident the amended policies were approved properly. Legal exposure goes beyond the individual. They were circling the wagons, but not around her, around themselves. I printed the chain, marked the headers, and slid it into the binder. Another notch in the strategy. Another signal to the state officials already reviewing the case. Then the courier arrived. A simple manila envelope, hand-delivered to Verna's door, and time-stamped by the state's oversight office. Inside, notice of pending investigation, formal request for documentation, and a warning of potential board dissolution should they fail to comply within 10 business days. I didn't see her open it, but I saw what came after. She showed up at the clubhouse that afternoon in full military-grade posture, collared jacket, gloves, that ridiculous embroidered board authority pin she wore like a badge. She slammed her car door hard enough to rattle the wind chimes on the porch next door. I watched from the other side of the street as she unlocked the clubhouse door and stepped inside, likely preparing her counterstrike. But it wouldn't matter. The walls were already crumbling. Johnner called 15 minutes later. "The insurer's out," he said. "They pulled coverage, full withdrawal, no backdated support. Verna's on her own." I didn't answer right away. He filled the silence. The second they saw the trajectory diagrams and those HOA memos, it was over. You did exactly what you needed to. I hung up, slid the phone into my pocket, and crossed the street. The HOA clubhouse wasn't locked, not yet. Inside, Verna was standing by the board table, rifling through a folder of old citations like she was preparing for a war that had already ended. When she heard the door open, she didn't look up. "You're trespassing," she said flatly. "No," I said. "I'm witnessing." She finally met my eyes. Her pupils were pinned, but her mouth was calm. Too calm. I knew that look. It was the same expression I'd seen on federal agents about to shred evidence before the feds arrived. "You think this changes anything?" she said. "This is still my community." I stepped closer. "Not anymore. The coverage is gone. The investigation started, and every neighbor you've ever bullied has a copy of your signature on illegal memos. You think you're holding the reins, Verna, but the horse left days ago." Her breath stuttered, just slightly. That split-second reaction told me everything. She'd assumed this would stay in-house. That fear and confusion would keep the neighborhood too disoriented to act. But she'd underestimated what people do when one of their own bleeds on the lawn. "You know what happens next?" I asked. She turned her back to me. I didn't press further. I didn't need to. The structure had already collapsed. All that remained was the formal confrontation. The meeting that would shift the HOA from intimidation to exposure. On my way out, I passed the community bulletin board. Verna's photo still hung at the top, a framed shot from the year she became president. Smiling, arms crossed, standing in front of a manicured hedge, she fined someone $75 for trimming too short. I didn't take it down. That wouldn't be justice. That wouldn't be truth. The truth was coming. And it would arrive with a full room, a state official, a forensic reconstruction report, and a wind chime fragment that still smelled faintly of smoke. The community hall filled faster than I expected. Not for a barbecue, not for a yard sale or HOA-sponsored nature walk, for a reckoning. Folding chairs lined the room in rigid rows, neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, eyes tight with something heavier than curiosity. Some looked nervous, some angry, most just tired. A kind of bone-deep exhaustion that settles in after years of being managed instead of heard. Verna sat alone at the head table, lips drawn into a taut line, hands folded like a politician at a press conference. The rest of the board had refused to join her. 3 had already resigned. 2 sent written statements distancing themselves from unilateral actions taken without proper procedural authorization. Behind her, the projector screen flickered to life. The state representative stood calmly to the side, a man in a slate-gray suit with a clipboard and the kind of tone that said he'd done this before. His name was Marin. He didn't smile. "Today's purpose," he began, "is to present initial findings from the active investigation into the governance practices of the Juniper Hollow Homeowners Association, in light of recent events and submitted evidence." He nodded to me. I stepped forward, placed the binder on the table, and opened it to the first page, the wind chime diagram. I didn't need notes, I didn't need flair, just truth. This diagram represents the trajectory of the bullet that struck my daughter Maris Thorne while she was seated on her porch swing during her baby shower, I said, letting the silence settle before continuing. The shot passed through this wind chime, metal and glass, handmade, before piercing her shoulder and abdomen. The angle proves the shooter was elevated and distant, not close and threatened as the incident report claims. I moved to the next page. This, I continued, is a photo of the wind chime's copper ring, bearing primer residue, the kind only found when a bullet passes through at muzzle velocity. Page 3, the amended safety clause. This is the memo issued by Verna Klatch, HOA president, granting herself firearm carry privileges during enforcement activity, without a community vote or insurance notification. This clause is not only unauthorized by the charter, it is illegal under nonprofit governance codes for incorporated HOAs in this state. I didn't need to raise my voice. The stillness in the room was louder than anything I could have said. I turned to Marin. He took over. His tone was clinical. Our office has confirmed that the HOA's Directors and Officers Insurance Policy has been suspended due to exposure created by this clause. Liability for any damages incurred now rests with individual board members. Verna flinched for the first time. Marin continued. The Department of Nonprofit Oversight is preparing formal suspension of the current board pending a compliance review and emergency vote. Should community members request it, a full board reformation may be initiated within 60 days. He paused, looking directly at the crowd. But only if you want it. That's when Elliot Bram stood. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just stood. His voice carried like gravel over stone. "I was on that board," he said, "and I watched her do this. I watched her escalate and twist the rules and threaten the people she didn't like. And I didn't say anything. That ends now." He looked down, cleared his throat, then turned back to Marin. "I move for dissolution, effective immediately." Marin nodded. "Motion recorded. Second?" Harriet from Lot 12 raised her hand. "Second." Marin turned to Verna. "Do you wish to respond?" She stood. For a moment, I thought she might erupt. Her eyes darted over the crowd, searching for allies. But there were none. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "I did what I had to do to keep this place safe." Marin didn't reply. He just clicked the pen in his hand. Motion passed. Effective as of this moment, the Juniper Hollow HOA board is suspended. Verna sank back into her seat like something inside her had finally run out of fuel. No shouting, no applause. Just a long, collective exhale. The sound of that exhale stayed with me for days. It was more than relief. It was release. A kind of shared breath no one in this neighborhood had taken in years. The board was gone. The rules that had ruled us had crumbled under the weight of their own arrogance. And Verna Klatch, for the first time, looked like what she'd always been, small. She didn't speak to me again after that night. She didn't have to. The state moved fast. Within 48 hours, she'd been placed under formal arrest, pending assault and negligence charges. Her mugshot hit the local paper 2 days later, right beneath the headline, "State Dismantles HOA After Shooting Investigation." I didn't read the article. I didn't need to. The picture said enough. No badge, no authority, no power left to wield. Elliot came by the next morning, clutching 2 cups of coffee from the corner shop. He looked 10 years younger, lighter somehow, even with the weight of guilt still visible in his posture. We stood on the porch where everything had started, the one still bearing the bloodstain Verna had called decorative debris. He didn't say much, neither did I. Sometimes silence is the only apology worth accepting. Behind us, the neighborhood was different. People were talking again. Kids were playing outside. Mrs. Beckley finally brought her dog out for a walk without glancing over her shoulder. The Hansons rehung their wind chimes. I counted 7 of them across the cul-de-sac. For the first time, the sound wasn't eerie. It was freedom. Maris was home by then. She'd healed faster than anyone expected, though the scar was still fresh. A pale reminder of how close we came to losing her. She spent most mornings in the rocker with the baby in her arms, humming the same lullaby her mother used to sing. I'd catch her staring sometimes, out toward the tree line, where the sound of a single chime drifted through the breeze. The new one, fused from the fragments of the old. When she first asked me to build it, I didn't want to. It felt wrong, turning something that symbolized a gunshot into a decoration. But she said, "It's not about the bullet, it's about the sound that came after." So I melted the metal, refashioned the glass, and etched her daughter's initials across the lowest ring. When it caught the light, it glowed faintly gold. We hung it above the same swing Verna tried to destroy, not as defiance, as proof that no matter how loud control pretends to be, peace can still return, piece by piece. The neighborhood held its first new community meeting 3 weeks later. No suits, no bylaws, no titles. Just folding chairs on the green, coffee thermoses, and laughter that didn't sound rehearsed. The state representative showed up again, this time smiling. He congratulated everyone on forming a provisional community council, not an HOA, a council. Something built on trust instead of signatures. Elliot was elected chair. He didn't want the position, but they wouldn't let him refuse. "You've earned it," Harriet said, patting his arm. "You were the first to stand up when it mattered." When it came time to speak, he cleared his throat and looked toward me. "We owe our peace to the thorns," he said, "but we owe our silence to no one." Applause followed, not loud, not theatrical, just enough to carry. For the first time, the sound didn't echo off walls built from fear. It lingered in open air, Later, when the sun dipped behind the roofs, I walked back to Maris's porch. The air smelled like rain, fresh and new. The wind picked up just enough to stir the chime, and for a brief second, it sang. I closed my eyes. It wasn't just sound, it was memory, rewritten. For 30 years, I'd seen what people do to one another when power goes unchecked. I'd testified, diagrammed, and archived it all. But this was the first time I'd watched a community unlearn its fear. The baby stirred in her bassinet, her tiny fingers curling toward the sound. Maris smiled. "She likes it," she whispered. "Good," I said. "She was born in the middle of the storm. She deserves to grow up in the calm." That night, I sat under the porch light, wind brushing my face, and listened to the chimes sing its fragile, steady song. It wasn't the melody of tragedy anymore. It was the sound of proof, the kind that lives on long after the shouting stops. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?